Introducing 100 Days of Code with Treehouse. What is 100 Days of Code? It's a long-standing coding challenge created by Alex Calloway, and it's simple. Commit to learning every day for 100 days. The amount that you learn in that short time frame will change your life. Whether you want to level up your skills or jumpstart a new career, commit to the challenge. You'll be shocked by how much you learn and accomplish. You'll have the full support of the Treehouse community of students working with you. We'll be sending you motivational emails, clips from our 100 Days of Code podcast, featuring advice, tips and tricks from developers, and so much more. There's never been a better time to commit to your learning. Join us. Hello, welcome to another edition of Design Q&A. It's hard to believe it's already August. I've been in shelter in place for so long now, I'm losing track of the days and the months, and somehow still remember the year. 2020 is pretty iconic so far. Here in the San Francisco Bay Area, August is known as Fogust because we have so much fog in the summer. But today it's like super sunny, and this year I planted a cherry tomato plant, and it's in full force right now. I have so many cherry tomatoes, and like every day I just look out there and I can see changes happening in the plant. So it's kind of cool to see, changes somewhere, even though the days feel kind of monotonous right now. So yeah, I hope y'all are doing well. Let me know how you're doing in the chat. So for those of you who are new to this, my name is Hope Armstrong. I'm a senior product designer and UX design teacher at Treehouse. Treehouse is at teamtreehouse.com if you want to check it out. It's the place to go for learning how to design and develop websites and mobile apps. So if you have any questions today, pop them into the chat. We have a lovely moderator checking out the chat, sharing this slide that I'm presenting today. So if you want to click the links or anything, feel free to check that out. And if you have any questions along the way, I'll pause a few times and see if I can answer any on the fly. And so this one's a little different this time because I didn't have any pre-submitted questions. So in typical quarantine fashion, I'm just going to ask myself a question, I guess, and then answer it. But I thought it would be fun to talk about designers who want to learn how to code, because I think this is on a lot of people's minds. So I'm a designer who wants to learn how to code, or at least learn the basics so I can better communicate with developers. How do I get started? So I would recommend starting with HTML and CSS because those are the building blocks of the web. So HTML is all the structure on the page. So it's the header, the body that contains all the images and paragraphs and what else? Buttons and links. And then CSS is the fun part, especially if you're a designer, because that's where you can style all of those elements. And so if you're used to using a program like Figma, there's actually already some CSS that they've started to add into it just to make the designer-developer handoff that much easier. So if you go into Figma and you look at the share link, you can click an element and it will show you the CSS. So the CSS, to be honest, is a little bit hit or miss. So the first section here, it's talking about the layout of where this text box appears. So this is using fixed widths, which I do not recommend because nowadays devices are all these different sizes, and you want to make sure that you're designing for a way that's like flexible and responsive is what they call it. So I don't recommend using these fixed pixels and saying, this text box always has to appear in this one spot. And if you do that, it's going to like float off the device's screen, right? So I don't recommend taking any CSS clues from there. But in the next part here, it shows the font family, which is Merriweather, and the font style is normal. If you wanted to do italics, that's where you would put italics. The font weight is 900, which means it's quite bold. So you'll get the hang of this over time, but 400 is normal. You can also just type normal or bold. If you have a font that you're serving that has a lightweight, you can do 100. And bold is really like 600 and up. If you have, so fonts can be like regular bold, extra bold, or black. And then that's why you'd want to choose like 600 versus 900. And then the font size is pretty obvious. You can do pixels, you can do REMs, EMs, it can get kind of complicated, but I want to keep this super beginner. So you can use the pixels that you're used to using in your design program. Line height is 40 pixels here. So if this were to wrap into another line, it would be 40 pixels in between each line. So that's also leading if you're used to typography terms. And then the color here is this text dark, because that's how I have it set up as a color style in Figma. That's why it's got this little comment out above here to tell me it's text dark. And then Adobe XD also does this. And so to do that in Adobe XD, you just want to set up your share link so that way the view setting is development mode. There's also design review mode, which wouldn't get you the code. So you want to choose development. And then once you do that, your share link will show all the code-centric stuff that you want to see. So here I have this avatar selected, and you can see that it has some layout properties, some of which I do not recommend. Maybe the width and height is interesting, but in terms of the top and left positioning, I would suggest just centering it with code instead of saying it has to be 128 pixels from the top and 185 pixels from the left, just to make it more flexible. And then for the width and height, that might be of interest, although the next level of learning about CSS is thinking about retina screens. So not all devices have the same pixel density. So if you have a retina screen, then you're going to have double the pixels. So you'll want to serve the images at 2x. But I want to show you the border here, which is why this is getting this white border, the 4-pixel border. And it's using the hex color 6Fs, which means white. And then opacity here, that's one of those, another one of those, you don't really need it because this is saying it's full opacity. If you wanted it to be 0.5 opacity, that would be 50% white if you want a little bit of translucency. But otherwise, everything on the page is naturally already opacity 1 or 100% opacity. So if you just want a little taste of what CSS properties are available, I recommend poking around in these tools that you're already familiar with. But like I said, I don't recommend copying it verbatim or using it as some kind of educational tool, because you're not going to even know the why behind it anyway. So I just want to take a step back and actually 20 years back. It's hard to believe this is actually when I started learning HTML and CSS. And I learned from this site called Lisa Explains It All. Let me know in the comments if you've ever watched Clarissa Explains It All. It was one of my all-time favorite shows. I think it was on the Disney Channel. I watched a lot of TV, mostly Nickelodeon, but I remember Clarissa Explains It All. And this site was a HTML and CSS educational site, kind of playing off of that branding and the name, obviously. This site was created by a young woman named Lisa. So this is what I learned from. And, early 2000s, the internet was very new. And so there were a lot of static text heavy websites. But the good thing about it was that it would show an example of the code. And I really learn well by looking at an example and then deconstructing it. So This is what HTML looks like. You can see that the tags are, or you can see that this is made of tags, and a tag is in these little anchor or angle brackets. And basically you open one. So you open the HTML document and then you close it. And then you open the head of the page and you insert the title, which is what you see in the tab in your browser. And then you close it and you open the body and you close it. So there's a lot of like nested tags and opening and closing of tags. And that's just what keeps everything neat and tidy. And so everything that appears on your site will be entered in the body for the most part. So the text and the images and so on. And then when it gets into the CSS, they also had examples and example code. And I just wanted to mention this just to like be nostalgic for a second. And this is how online education was back in the early 2000s. And like compared to what we have now, which like shameless plug for the product that I work on, Teamtreehouse.com has interactive ways of learning HTML and CSS. This is a screenshot I took from our introduction to HTML and CSS course that is performed by Treasure, one of our teachers. And it's a video where she like shows you the code as she's writing it. You can also follow along on your computer if you download the project. And there's interactive coding challenges. So you can test what you learn in the video by poking around in these HTML and CSS files. And then you just follow along and like answer what it asks you to do with the code. And they're pretty small asks, so you can just do like incrementally checking what you know. So in this case, you're changing the headline to purple. So H1 just means like the biggest headline on the page. And then you can check your work, so you can see how you're progressing. And you'll get to a point where, like I said, you want to download that project and check it out on your computer. And one of the things I love about HTML and CSS is it's really easy to just check it out locally on your computer, or to run it locally on your computer. You just open it up in Chrome, or whatever browser that you're used to. And so this is a really simple HTML document, and it's linking off to my style sheet over here. But you do want to make sure that you have a text editor that is a code editor specifically. So I like to use Sublime Text because it has, you can also use Atom, or you can use Visual Code Studio. Those are some other like popular ones right now. But with Sublime Text, and probably other ones too I'm not familiar with, you can install plugins if you want to have like specific capabilities. And also the settings are super customizable, and you can really go to town making it exactly how you want it. But the basics of a code editor is it's going to give you syntax highlighting based on the extension of the file. So this is an HTML file. You can see all the tags are pink. I happen to install a plugin that changed the colors of the syntax highlighting, to the surprise of no one, probably. Like designers want certain colors, I guess. Not just designers, probably most developers have picky preferences when it comes to that stuff, and it's fun. So so the tags are pink in my case, and all the other properties are like this green and this yellow. So that helps me keep it tidy. And another thing I love is if you click into a tag, it highlights where that tag is closed. Because I've run into some things where like there's a bug in my code and I can't figure it out, and it's because I forgot to close a tag. And that's why the layout is all busted, which is super frustrating. It's like when you misspell something in your code, it's like, shouldn't have happened. And then, here's the very simple style sheet in CSS. I'm coloring the headers blue. And then so once you have the basic file set up, you can just double click on the HTML page and open up in your browser. And then you just keep making changes and refreshing the page. So that's pretty much how I learned, is just trial and error, trying something out, refreshing the page, seeing what happened, and endless forever for 20 years. I also love to, let me just pause for a second. Okay, I don't see any questions so far, so I guess we're all good. Another thing I like to do is, as I'm browsing the internet, I'll see something that I like and go, ooh, I wonder how they did that. So this is Slack's website, which, great example of web design. And what you can do is, if I remember how to advance my slides, you can right click and then inspect the element. So I'm using Chrome, so it might look a little bit different, but if you're using Safari or Firefox, they all have a way to inspect an element. And that brings up the dev tools. So this is the fun part. When I realized this like blew my mind, because it's basically like giving you a glimpse into how the website's made, which I was that kid that like took apart all of her Tamagotchis to see how they worked inside and like sometimes forgot how to put them back together. But this is totally like the kind of stuff that I crave, is like digging into something and seeing how it works. So anyway, here you can see this is all their HTML. You can see sections and divs, which are collections of elements, and they all have classes. And these classes are tied to the CSS. So that's how in CSS, you can select a class that's in the HTML, and that's how you can apply a style. So I dug into their HTML and I found this anchor link. So all links are made through the A tag, and A just stands for anchor. I don't even know why, but that's the way it is. And they're anchor tags. So if I select that, I can see all the CSS that's applied to it. So let's say I was interested in this drop shadow. How beautiful, right? It's like kind of subtle, but this is like a really kind of trendy style right now, is this like subtle, wide drop shadow. And you can see they applied it with the CSS box shadow. So the first two numbers here are saying that the box shadow starts from the very center. So it's just from the center of the card and radiating out. So if you have a light source to the right and you want to drop the shadow to the bottom left, this is where you would offset that box shadow. And then the width of the box shadow, or the drop shadow in this case, is 2 rem. So that's responsive. I don't know what the E and M stands for, to be honest. But it's a more responsive, more modern way of, instead of writing pixels. And then the RGBA is the red, green, blue color channels, and then the alpha channel to be semi-translucent. So 000 is saying it's black, and then it's 0.1 opacity in the alpha channel. Hopefully everyone's following. I know that's kind of like math sounding, which can be scary, but it's 10% black. So that's how it's getting that nice subtlety. And then to take it a step further, you can also force a state. So if you're a designer, you're probably like designing these interactions, right? And so I noticed that some changes happened whenever I hovered over these cards. So I wanted to see the CSS that was applied to it. So if you right click on the anchor, you can do force state and hover, and you can see what is happening. So in this case, you can see the box shadow got darker. Now it's 20% black. And further down, I don't think I mentioned this very like clearly, but you want to look for colon and hover for the hover state. So it's getting a transform with CSS, and the scale is increasing 1.05x. In other words, it's getting 5% bigger. And so whenever you look at these CSS properties, there's often different options that are available. So CSS transforms can do a bunch of different 2D transforms, but you're not expected to know the syntax right off the gate. And I'm constantly looking this stuff up because CSS is like a massive API. You could think about it like that. But a resource that a lot of people use is called MDN Web Docs. And so this is put out by Mozilla, the folks that make Firefox. And you can look it up and you can see, oh, okay, here are some other transforms I can do. So you can do a matrix, which I have never done. I think it's way too complicated. It's basically combining all 6 of the 2D transforms into one line. And I think that's too confusing. So moving on to translate. Translate means you can move the element across the X and Y axis. Scale means that you can just do one scale if you want like an overall scale, increase or decrease of the icon or the element on the page. In this case, it's a really warped Firefox icon that's twice as wide and half as tall. You can also rotate with a turn, or you can do degrees. And you can skew if you really want to warp an image, totally break the aspect ratio and really stretch it out all wonky. And then the last one is just telling you that you can chain all these together. So you can do half the scale, and then you can also move it negative percentages. I know, isn't that wild? So there's all kinds of details here, and you're just going to be referencing this your whole career because there's just so much to learn about CSS, and I think that's one of the things that makes it really exciting. All right. Still no other questions, but feel free to let me know if you're feeling lost. Happy to answer your questions. Another resource is CSS Tricks. I've found so much value out of their articles. Whenever I've had a question about something, it usually comes up in my Google search results because they've usually have written an article about it. But this site was made from Chris Coyier, who's like well known in the front end community. And he has a lot of guest contributors who are also super smart and know their stuff. So I recommend checking out that site. And they also have this collection of beginner documents too. Another favorite of mine is Una Kravitz. She's a developer advocate for Chrome. So she works at Google and she does this web show called Web Dev Live. And I love her energy and her expertise, and she has a lot of great developer resources. And she kind of comes at it from a designer angle too. I think maybe she started as a designer and became a developer or something like that. But I really like her approach, and it is similar, similar mind as I have, I think, because she's got that visual interest. So she has videos up on YouTube, so check her out. She did this video on 10 modern layouts in one line of CSS, which if you had told me that 20 years ago, it would have blown my mind. Because 20 years ago, we were working with like absolute positioning and floats, and there were entire CSS frameworks for doing layouts and grids. And if anyone in the chat remembers this time, wasn't really that long ago, to be honest. But these days we have modern updates to CSS that make it way easier. So if you ever tried learning CSS 10 years ago and you got frustrated, check it out today, because now we have things like Flexbox and CSS Grid, and the browsers are on board with it and supporting it. And it's more fun to write CSS in 2020 is what I'm saying. And a lot simpler to make layouts. So as a companion piece to that video, like I said, she's really good at documenting these things and creating tools for designers and developers. So I have a link to it here in my slides, but she goes like step by step by example. Like I mentioned with Lisa Explains It All, it helps to see the example alongside the code. And just to take it a step further, the icing on the cake is she has this little current browser support section here that tells you it's all good on the 4 major browsers. Another site I like for inspiration is Codepen, which I think is also a Chris Coyier thing, if I'm remembering correctly. But it's basically a user-submitted list of code snippets. So for this, I found this one where I like this underline style, or this text link style. And basically all the links are underlined red, and then when you hover, it becomes highlighted red. So I guess this is how Wired used to do it, maybe in their magazine. I looked at their site the other day and it didn't look like they were still doing this style, but regardless, you can just take these snippets and add them to your own code. You can also fork them, meaning like make a copy and then iterate on it. But it's a really fun community that has a lot of like interesting things that they're doing. How do I say this? There's a lot of really interesting code snippets on there, and I've gotten a lot of enjoyment, especially watching like how to do animated CSS. That's another one fun part of CSS. And as you can see, I hearted this one because I wanted to save it. So you can save all your favorites and then like repurpose it into one of your projects later on. And so at Treehouse, we have something called Tracks. So if you want to check it out, it's basically a collection of courses and workshops and practice sessions. And you can go through, if you have a specific goal, like let's say you're a graphic designer, but you want to learn some web programming skills, it kind of talks to you from where you're at and kind of builds in those front-end capabilities that you want to learn. And then let's say you have more limited time and you just want to focus on learning HTML for starters. This is a smaller track. You can see it's only 10 hours and focuses on the basics of HTML. And then there's a web design track, which is a bit of everything from like UX design to front-end development. And if you want to go like gung-ho into like learning all about front-end and even JavaScript, then that would be amazing. And this is a longer time commitment at 57 hours, but totally doable. All right, so I already blew through all my slides, so feel free to ask me questions if there's anything that you're curious about. It doesn't have to be about coding. I forgot to mention, but like if you're a designer who is super interested in other aspects like user research and visual design and prototyping and all that, and you don't have any interest in code, that's totally fine, by the way. But if you are interested in code, it is a huge asset and can help you work on that side of the spectrum design-wise, if that makes sense. I kind of see UX design as a spectrum. Like there's people that are more interested in the beginning phases of like user research and iterating and kind of working on the core concepts and finding pain points. And then, there's people in the middle that are really into visual design. They do a little bit of UX research, a little bit of coding. There's people that are kind of in the middle to the right side, and they're like visual designers who love to code as well. And, there's people that are all across the spectrum like I am. I'm so interested in all of it that I can't choose. So feel free to reflect and think about where you land on that spectrum. And there's so many opportunities out there for all of us that I can't say all designers need to know how to code, because it's just not true. Because if you learn more about coding, maybe you're not learning as much about user research. So it's always a give and take when you decide what you want to learn and specialize in. Oh, I have a question. Cool. Which wireframing tool is the most common in the industry? Wireframing tools. So I would say that Figma and Figma, Sketch, and XD are the three most common. And so with those three, you can do wireframing, and you can also do prototypes and mock-ups. And so that makes them really flexible. If you specifically want to just focus on wireframing, and maybe you don't care so much about taking those wireframes into pixel perfection lands and interactivity lands, then you can use a tool called Balsamiq. It's just much more streamlined for wireframing specifically, and there's a lot of like drag and droppable components, and it's really user friendly. And I think a lot of project managers like using a tool like that because, like I said, they're not interested in the visual design of it and like taking it further. Because if you were to set up a wireframe in a tool like Balsamiq, you would have to recreate it whenever you want to turn it into a mock-up. So you'd have to recreate it in Sketch or Figma, which can be frustrating. How does product design work at Treehouse? What does a day in the life look like? Oh my goodness. That's a big question. So I am the only product designer at Treehouse right now. So it's all on my shoulders. But we have a lot of really smart engineers who I feel like they make some excellent product design decisions too. And we have some excellent marketing designers as well. Yeah, so I do user research, I do user interviews, I do wireframing, I make mock-ups, I do prototypes. I do have the coding skills, so a lot of times I don't really go into making prototypes for Treehouse because I'm already set up with our app locally. So we have a Ruby on Rails app. And so I'll just go ahead and like start a branch and get that set up, or maybe the developer will set up the bare bones based on my mockup that I usually do in Sketch, and then sync it to InVision if I do the prototype. But like I said, often I don't do that. So usually I set up the mockup in Sketch and then share it. I guess I would share it with the developer through InVision. But I wouldn't do the prototyping. Or maybe I guess a more complex project I would. If it's just a simple, like, here's what we're going to do for this page, then I don't like fuss over like doing the interactivity within the page, because I can do that with code. So I would go into the branch and Git, and I would just set that up, and do the styling. So maybe the developer like sets up the bare bones and like, hey, Hope, this is functional, but it doesn't look pretty and it's not to the specifications of the mockup. And then I would go in and like do the layout and the styling and everything. And then on top of that, I'm also a UX design teacher. So I'm kind of split between, or I am definitely split between teaching and product design. So in terms of a typical day, it super varies, because sometimes I'm like writing a script for my next practice session, which I was doing yesterday. Maybe I'm preparing for a live stream that we're doing right now. But then other times, like we just launched our pre-paywall site. We just did the redesign. And so for that, I was working in design systems because I updated our CSS framework for that called Leap. If you want to check it out, it is publicly available. It's open source. It's basically, if you've ever used Bootstrap, it's kind of like our own Bootstrap. And it makes it really easy to use reusable classes and components and stuff like that. So that way we're not like reinventing the the style sheet for every page that we make. I'm trying to think what else I could tell you. But yeah, if we're kicking off a bigger project, a bigger product design project, like recently I updated the tech degree project page, and I interviewed some tech degree students and asked them about what they thought about the project submission process and how they felt about the way that the product is presented on the page. And then I did some iterations, did some other sets of interviews as I was working on the prototype, which I set up in InVision. That's another example when I would set up a prototype, is when I want to do some user interviewing. So during that time at Treehouse, I was doing a lot more user interviews and jotting down all the feedback. So I would say there's a lot of variability, and no day is the same, which is what's kind of cool about working at a smaller company like Treehouse. So Treehouse is 50 people. And like I said, there's 2 marketing designers, 1 product designer. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to wear a lot of hats. I forgot to mention, we also have a motion designer, which makes all the beautiful animations that we have in our courses and on social media. But back to my train of thought. So when you work in a smaller team, specifically a smaller design team, there's a lot of opportunity to stretch yourself in different areas and take ownership and responsibility for designing the experience. Whereas a bigger company, you can get stuck like working on a very, very, very small part of Facebook, for instance. Like maybe you have a very small ownership, and maybe like I've heard of people that have worked at Apple and they only do prototyping, like all day, every day prototyping, which to me, I mean, that sounds kind of boring to me because I'm like, blah, all over the place, interested in all the things. But, and I like the variety, but if you want to like be super niche and like be an expert in one area, that could be the place for you, right? So that was a long-winded answer, but thank you for that thoughtful question. That really made me think. All right, I think we have a few more minutes, so I'll just pause for a moment and see if there's any other questions here. Do you all have any UX design courses that you'd love for me to tackle next? That would be good for me to know. So the next course that I'm working on after this practice session comes out, the one that I was writing the script for yesterday, it's going to be on ethics. So it's going to be about making ethical product decisions. So I'm really interested in that. I just read this book called Ruined by Design by Mike Monteiro. So highly recommend that book if you're curious. It's a little angsty and kind of extreme. But I don't know, you'll see what I mean if you start reading it. It's a very specific style that the author has, but I agree with some of it, maybe not all of it, but I think it's a really cool way of thinking about the responsibility that we have as people who make products that people use and that affect people's lives. And so there's a lot of introspection that book has made me do, actually. Have you covered product strategy yet as a course? I feel like maybe several years ago when we had more business type courses. Are you thinking product strategy like, oh, let's see what is an immersive topic in the world, and like let's design a product for that pain point? Is it like that early stage, oh, let's like build a product around this thing that I see in the world? Is that kind of what you're thinking in terms of product strategy? I guess as a as a UX designer, I'm often, following the recommendations from the CEO or the product management or the sales team, and kind of listening to what they're seeing in terms of the customer feedback and what they're seeing in the industry and where they see, ed tech going. So I guess I haven't had the influence at that high of a level. I basically like take what I have, take my known knowns, and it's like, okay, we want to improve our product for libraries. How can we improve our product for libraries? But I don't go out and say like, who's a new audience that Treehouse could target? Because that's like above what I think about as a UX designer, because it's a little bit outside of my decision, because I'm like smaller on the ladder of things. It's more of like an executive decision. So yeah, I guess that's a long way of saying I don't think we specifically have that kind of course, and I'm interested in where that would fit. Because I guess our core audience is designers and developers, so less so the product owners who would make the product strategy decisions. Although I guess as a designer and developer, you can always push back and say, you know what, I don't know if this makes sense to focus on this thing because I have this other idea about how we could do our product strategy. So someone asked, what is wireframing? So sorry I didn't explain that before and you felt lost. So wireframing, imagine a blueprint for a website. So it's basically a very bare bones sketch of the general layout of a page. So you can imagine just an outline drawing of a website. And so a wireframe is something you would do kind of early on in the process of designing a website, or early on in like thinking about how to redesign a website. So it lets you think about the content and the layout without worrying so much about how it's going to look and feel with all the colors and styling and all the visual design decisions. It lets you just focus strictly on the flow of the page from one to another, and then also how the content is laid out. Okay, so content strategy response, almost kind of like how a designer can practice internal entrepreneurship and how to influence product decisions beyond requirements, or how to interpret those requirements in the first place. Oh, okay. Yeah, so I guess it's kind of like pushing back or understanding on what's asked of you. So your manager comes to you and is like, hey, we're gonna ask you to design this feature for the product. And you're like, well, why should we add that feature? And then if you better understand the product strategy, then you can design a better experience, huh? Yeah, I think how to influence product decisions beyond requirements is, I guess, like starting to ask why we're building something, why we're focusing on that, and understanding that executive level decision, and seeing if maybe, sometimes you're asked to add a feature and it's not really the right solution for the problem. So understanding that root cause is important. So they call that root cause analysis. And so they might, maybe an executive comes up to you and is like, hey, we need to add, let me think of an example on the fly. Let's add, can I think of an example? Let's add online mentorship to Treehouse. Okay. Why? Why are we adding online mentorship? Well, students want to have one-on-one support as they're learning new skills. And it's like, okay, well, maybe there's other ways that we can support students too. Like maybe it's not like a one specific thing. Maybe you can iterate on that idea, solving that problem, but maybe not taking that feature idea verbatim and saying, okay, well, I'm going to look at this objectively and think about all the other ways in which we can support students. Because maybe there's not just one way. Maybe we can do 5 different features. Maybe we can look at the impact of offering one-on-one mentorship. Like, do we have the staffing? Like, what would that look like realistically? We want to make sure we're setting up expectations to our students that we can deliver on. So yeah, I think it's just having that conversation about like why is this a request, and like, okay, let's create the space to iterate on that idea. So that way you're not just handed a solution and being asked to prettify it, but you're actually part of the conceptual building of it. And also like creating a solution that really solves the core problem. Because maybe the solution that was handed to you is not the best solution. And then how to interpret those requirements in the first place. Yeah, I think I answered your question. But I think that to your point, yeah, I don't think we've really touched on that in the UX design curriculum. So thank you for that little bit of content request. I do appreciate that. And I'll bring that up with the UX squad meeting, which I'm going to in like 15 minutes. So me and the other UX design teachers meet every week and we talk about things like this. So, all right, I think that's a wrap. I don't see any more pressing questions. And I hope that answered a few questions you have about coding. And thank you so much. And I hope you have a good month, and I'll see you in September. Have a good summer. Take care.